Hoher Baum in awe. That's from Rilke. That's the opening of the first sonnet to Orpheus.
Wow.
Rainer Maria Rilke.
My God.
Yeah.
Nicola, thank you very much for that sensitive.
Yeah.
I'm going to start this now. We are recording these talks one by one. Welcome to ANPA. I was going to say 1944. No, ANPA 44. Our first speaker is Mike Hornus, who's live from Geneva.
Well, Switzerland anyway.
Okay, Switzerland. And I'm going to leave it to you, Mike, to start talking and share your screen at the appropriate moment. And then when
I'm going to go straight away to sharing, okay. Which of these many things should I put up? That one, I think.
Yeah, screen. Yeah, the green button.
Right.
Yes, this. You want to see us? Speaker. Can we see the speaker instead?
we do. This thing, this is. Oh, there's a hole in here.
How many people do we have in attendance at the moment, Andrew?
In the flesh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Okay.
Pass me a book. I'm going to get some blue tape.
All right. Shall I begin then?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Too big.
The title of my talk is A Model of Reality Based on Energy, Matter and Information. The word information is the focus, since almost all other models of reality seem to have ignored information. And a key idea I'd like you to hang on to is the idea of form and substance. So for the benefit of anybody who's got onto the wrong Zoom, this is a conference, Zoom and face-to-face, run by the Alternative Natural Philosophy Association, and the idea of putting natural philosophy in red is that there seems to have been a return to natural philosophy, which is, if you like, a superset of physics, biology, and other things. So my position today is, if you like, a natural philosophy thing, and with the exception of one equation, I will not bother you with the numeric stuff. The founders, Bastian, Kilminster, Noyes, Amson, and Frederick Parker Rhodes, they got together, and in the periods when they were really doing their top work, the world of science was very confused, and it seems that the philosophical turn is now, if it were, coming into place and explaining why the physics people have had so much difficulty. My own position is that I have been involved with ANPA for 40 years. And unusually, when I joined in 1983, there was an interview process. And Pierre Noyes, who in a way was the sort of formal person who put the ANPA thing into a legal state, he asked me to do several things. And they are roughly in order: to be active in research and attend meetings, to bring in younger people, to assist in running ANPA, and use the combinatorial hierarchy. And he didn't say it, but he hoped we would individually and collectively do something original. Now, as a researcher and previously a research manager, the idea of research is often around the key question. Ideally, it should be a question which is difficult and not impossible, but actually does something interesting. I picked up a notion in 1983 that information theory was important. In a way, this was an escape from information technology. This kept going, and in 2012, I teamed up with a mathematician, and our one-liner was to use physical systems theories applied to the planet and civilization. Unfortunately, my mathy companion died, and I then got on to understand the civilization under the heading of social systems and meaning. I went down that rat hole for most of the years 20 to 21, 2 and 3. But last year, 2022, I made a twist. I decided I was going to look at reality with information along with matter and energy as fundamentals. Hopefully this leads to something original. Strangely enough, in 1995, I gave a talk to the British Library Research Association, and Clive Kilminster, who I'd invited, was in the audience. And after all the questions and answers, which there were many, he came up to me and he said, "On behalf of the audience, Michael, we still do not know what information is." In the year 2022, I was researching for the work I do, and I looked into the beautiful lecture series by Feynman, and right at the front of the section on energy, he said in summary, "We can measure energy, but we do not know what it is." So in true, if you like, philosophical mode, I decided that I would tack this idea of how do we know what something is onto the set of things that I got interested in. Late last year, I unearthed some of the books I'd been reading earlier, and the key notion of Owen Barfield was in the book Saving Appearances, which is his masterpiece of 3 particular important books in his work. The title of his masterpiece is Saving Appearances, A Study in Idolatry. And when he was talking to David Bohm, they were big friends, the idea that Bohm had that we have trouble with understanding each other was explained by Barfield. He said, in the beginning, meaning mankind emerged, we communicated with each other in a perfectly understandable universal language. And then somebody decided to build a model, probably of a man. And then they took the model inside and made a church. And then they forgot that the model was just a model, and all of the connected ideas behind that model or behind the word got lost. And that's what he called idolatry. And in the introduction to his book in 1957, he said, "There may be times when what is most needed is not so much a new discovery as a different slant," which I think is sort of Oxbridge for thinking outside the box. Last year, I attended as part of the organizing team a 3-day workshop which was to do with energy. I was responsible at the end to collect together all of the discussions and the side comments and so on, many of which were recorded. And I looked in the sort of mode of thinking about the whole business, the whole 3-day workshop, and I discovered some general ideas. First of all, nobody was able to explain, but they wanted to moan about the state of the planet and civilization. As far as I could tell, nobody was questioning why, nobody was questioning when, and everybody was so specialized they couldn't really talk to each other, So there was a fragmentation of views. And for most, if you like, disappointing for me, not a single word, not a single talk mentioned information, with a vague request in the computer context to say, what is the difference between data, information, knowledge, and wisdom? So after some months of cleaning up all these talks and putting them into an interesting visual package, I decided that I was going to take some actions. I wanted to explain why. I wanted to understand by looking at the longer term, and I wanted to put together an integrated approach, which means perhaps the title of this talk might even be original. So without going through all of the things I did, one of the important one is that humanity disconnected from nature when we began speaking and writing about 30,000 years ago, which is totally consistent, by the way, with Barfield's work, which he discovered by looking at the history of languages, particularly through poetry. Another important point is that Western languages use a law of the excluded middle, which leads to impossible negotiations and gives us as a clue as to why the political system is in deep trouble. This comes up later. So now I'm thinking about the idea of a notion of reality, and I wandered through the literature and of course used Google and so on, and I found a little quote by Wolfgang Pauli, who's a respected physicist and thinker, and he said, "The formulation of a new idea of reality is the most important and most difficult task of our time." I also looked around and discovered relatively recently one fellow traveler, a guy called Dirk with a Dutch name I won't pretend to pronounce. And he said there are good reasons to ask basic questions on the construction of reality. And we, meaning him and his companions in his work in Holland, is we highlight the role of information. Nobody else, as far as I can tell, had raised information to the level of being fundamental. When I was a working person, I had a research job which took me around to various parts of the world, including California. And when I was looking into these things, I recalled a meeting with Jeffrey Chu, who was on the AMPA advisory board. I was theoretically the secretary to that. And he came up with a concept which is known as the bootstrap principle. And the beautiful phrase, which is often quoted by people who are admirers of his, nature is as it is because this is the only possible construction consistent with itself. That, I think, is a clue as to the nature of reality. So here I just summarize my reality investigations, which have been going on for several years. And I just mentioned two by Eric Jansch and Balding, which are to do with the self-organizing systems. There's a very interesting piece of work by a physicist working with a religious group. By the man's name is Swim, and I've selected as a starting point the work of The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. His name is not really Pierre, it's probably a short form of being a priest. And I decided, because of the long-termness, that I would invoke knowledge from ancient sources, from modern knowledge that I'm aware of and have been impressed with in the past few years, and also the people's knowledge, which I include under those three headings. To summarize the situation then, I would like to pay attention to John Wheeler. Wheeler lived a long life, and at the end of his life, he said, I thought it was material, then I thought it was living, then I thought it was information. And he named all these phrases, but his, if you like, casual throwaway line was it from bit, which of course is a hint towards information. And Shannon but the it, of course, is reality. He often said, when he pleaded with people, please, could you figure out what information is? And nobody did. But hopefully, if he's somewhere in connection with us, we'll hear this. He'll hear this. So, Teilhard de Chardin, absolutely incredible human being. The people who wrote about him actually praised him so much that what somebody actually said, Teilhard de Chardin will be regarded as the fourth major thinker of Western Christian tradition, the others being St. Paul, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. So I chose somebody who's got a bit of a track record, and also from our point of view, he gives us timetable. His personal conclusions, reworded in just 2 lines, is that the universe is a living system. There's nothing which is not living. Everything, even what we call inert, is living. And that the fruit of this tree of life is humanity itself. And his claim, along with others, Boehm and others, people who will come up later, is that humanity collectively forms what he calls the noosphere, which is a growth from the biosphere. So the Hermetic principles, which go back, it is alleged, 20 or 30,000 years, but were rewritten relatively recently, is a source of thinking. There are 7 principles, and the first one is called mentalism, and in the notion that everything is called all in the Hermetic scheme, all is thought. Then there's a correspondence idea, which is as above, so below, which is a phrase you may have heard many, many times. And this, of course, implies multiple levels of reality, at least 2, but in fact many. The principle of dynamic opposition I'll go into a little later, but 2 new things. One in line 3 there, the universe is always moving, and there is a rhythmic to-in and fro-in, which is not really understandable until we get a bit further into this. I looked into the work of Gurdjieff, whose student, Bennett, managed to fish out 20 forms of energy, and here I'm focusing on the middle group. So if we start at the bottom there, it says birth of life with the asterisk. There appear to be in what you might call the life energy group, 4 different ones, and then there's a transition to what Teilhard de Chardin called the birth of thought. So this is the region of interest to us, or at least I think it is. I have preached before to ANPA, and I'm a huge admirer of the work of Stefan Lupasco, which is available in English through Joseph Brenner, and is his massive work called The Philosophy of Reality. Now, there are 3 or 4 important things. First of all, Lupasco's idea is that the way we think, the way we do logic and reasoning must correspond precisely to the way reality is. And his thesis, which is called the New Discourse and Method, was never ever taken up. This was very sad. The French regarded him as a sort of Einstein-level person, but he was fired. And the reason he was fired is because the accounting department didn't have a department budget for polymaths. They had department budgets for the very, very specialized people. However, I hope that he, wherever he is, will appreciate that some of his work is coming back. And the one which I'd like to explore a little bit is the principle of dynamic opposition. Since we're trying to combine, or I'm trying to combine energy, information, and matter, in the idea of the principle of dynamic opposition, energy has 2 aspects. And in his terminology, the information or potential aspect is the dual of the matter aspect. So you can see from the diagram, there's a sort of hint that this could be building blocks into a multi-level hierarchy. So I'm using the two words, potential and actual. And in the actual case, matter, which is, if you like, positive energy, information, strangely enough, looks like it could well be negative energy. I also spoke some years ago on the work that my friend Eric Jarrell and I did, and we discovered merely by doing what is now sort of using data to develop patterns, we found multiple levels of patterns in nature. The Kondratiev cycle was our first victory. We found it wasn't a cycle, it was a natural thing in nature. On the political side, if we say, using the PDO principle, there's an idea, perhaps on the left, if you're an American, it might be the left wing of the political system and the right wing of the political system, who do not have any way of communicating with each other because they use, in their thinking and their writing and everything else, the law of the excluded middle, which denies the possibility. But nature would say the left and the right ought to work together and come up with a new idea. And this is totally consistent with the work of C.S. Peirce, who is regarded, although he was never alive when it was used as a word, the scheme called biosemiotics. He delved into his dissatisfaction with the ideas of logic. We normally only accept deduction in induction, but he claims that there's some wiggle room in induction, and he insists there's a third category, which is called abduction. So if we're thinking about that political situation, if Peirce was there, he'd say, you need a new idea and raise the game to a new level. One of the most important things which came up, and now we're in the middle of the living part of the energy spectrum, is the content of the work of Maturana and Varela. They were for a while working separately on the ideas of cognition and the ideas of cell structures. And together they discovered that they should think of the whole thing as a unity. So if autopoiesis discovered at the cell level is a general idea, which I'm going to claim it is, then the cell is a living thing made up of a physical and a, if you like, sign system, which is the form of the physical thing. And so the idea of autopoiesis is that the cell's duty is to reproduce itself using material and using its own export into the immediate environment so that it continues to live. And of course, there's always a little chance of something different. So not only does it live, but gradually it evolves. The same idea in the time scales that we're talking about, probably 3 to 6 billion years, the cell became the stabilizing force on the planet, which is called the biosphere. This was put together by Vernadsky, who worked with Bohm and also with Teilhard de Chardin. And the event known as the biosphere can be thought of as all of the living things, including humans, working together in a vast, powerful semiotic system. De Chardin wishes to have thought as a system separated out as an additional thing, which he calls the noosphere. In my period of exercising my brain into systems theory, I became a fan of Niklas Luhmann. And Luhmann had adopted both the idea of cognition and autopoiesis, and also, by the way, laws of form. And he, therefore, in a sense, was saying that the reason that we have so much difficulty in changing our minds about things we believe in is that social systems are autopoietic. So it's not just ourselves, but it's all the other people that we work with who have to somehow agree that what is now got a different meaning. Again, he was one who believed that civilization took a bad turn about 50,000 years ago, and the bad turn could be characterized by using human speech, which led to writing and printing, and even worse, to computing. So we stopped 50,000 years ago using, for most purposes, nature's universal language.
If the other bus can't stop this.
And now we'll just briefly go on to the ideas of information. Tom Stonier, who I met several times, he was anxious that we should elevate information to be a property of the universe and therefore should take part in a model of reality. Gregory Bateson was one of the great contributors to thinking about what information is, and he had a famous sentence: information is the difference that makes a difference. And the word difference, which comes up twice, you deal with that immediately as you're reading and thinking. There's a hint there that thought is actually very, very quick, maybe even instantaneous. The part in red is important to this idea of figuring out what is. One of the pieces of relevant information thinking is a sort of outlier. Erwin Laszlo, a great thinker, great worker, has spent a lot of time thinking about the Akashic records. If you hadn't heard about the Akashic records, it is the entire history of everything that's ever been. It can be looked at as a memory bank containing details about everything, including personal details, or even details at the level of your cells. Laszlo, he says information about every spirit, and in that sentence the word spirit means like a personality or human being, but not just as a physical object. So in a way, my entire thesis is that I am, with your help, trying to put together a theory of reality, which is an outgrowth, an evolution of Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory of evolution being one of the most powerful theories that we've had, even though it only arrived in the mid-1800s. It can be split down into 5 parts. There's the idea of the perpetual change. I would argue that in the Hermetic principle vocabulary, the perpetual change means it's all movement, but the Darwinian system is only applicable in the normal way of thinking to living systems. The idea of common descent is implying multi-level activities, and yet the language of the time, which was of course classical Newtonian thinking, was that we live in a single level universe. And yet, in a way, the idea of the hierarchy of species getting bigger and more complicated is indication that's probably not right. So I'm now trying to summarize in the same way that we could possibly accept the way of Darwinian thinking is this new proposed reality which I'm working towards. The major feature which I find is that there are 2 spaces, and these spaces sum to 0 energetically. Matter, as we have often assumed, lives in actual space. Living matter evolves within limits, and it's in a 3-dimensional thing, 3-dimensional space. What has been discovered recently is that there is another space, and I'm claiming that this is where information and thought occur and live. Just by chance, I had been studying some really seriously weird things about number theory when I stumbled over this and found that there is a notion of dimension -1. And next, perhaps the most unusual thing, is that these 2 spaces are rhythmically compared. Nature seems to not want to give up anything, but it needs to make progress step by step. And this is not in one direction only. Sometimes she decides to go back. There are multiple levels which I have equated, or shall we say connected, to the idea of energy levels. And the most important thing is that nature records everything, but the evolution at each level is autopoietic. The cells generate new cells. The organs generate new organs. The human body generates new human bodies. The social systems generate new bodies, and so on and so on. So, a very complicated but easy to explain notion of reality. So here I want you to think of a person, maybe yourself, maybe you and a few others. Your physical body lives in actual space for up to 100 years, but at the same time, that's the wrong word, this, if you like, simultaneously, we live in a potential space, and the mind, I use it separate from the brain, the mind is part of potential space, and all of the records, therefore all of your memories, are there. It is possible to imagine that if these memories are stored in some reasonable way, that you, when you think about your memory, you are traversing through your private memory bank. If you are thinking about something like the other person, perhaps your spouse or partner, if your thoughts are roughly the same, the more you get to be the same, the more likely it is that you'll be thinking the same thoughts. And the whole principle of morphic resonance comes in here. I think one day we'll be able to give an explanation to the guy who's fond of that idea. Now, continuing, if a human body, using the words of the semiotic people, if the human body can be thought of as scaffolding at different levels, and at each level there's a language, a sign language, then how it is that a human being is, if you like, coordinated is a mystery, but it can be thought of, at least in principle, by saying all these millions of cells are managed to be cooperative. All these organs are managed and grew together to be cooperative. So if we then try and visualize this level of reality, which, if there are 20 levels of energy, must span, here is a pathetic visual level, a visual idea of what I've been trying to specify with these various constraints. Back to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he said that there is matter, the birth of matter, sometimes called the Big Bang. He said there's the birth of life as a significant event. There's the idea of humans, which came with the birth of thought a little later. And then he implies that there is something beyond that. In his way of trying to understand things, he says that there are two, at least, methods of understanding something. There's the external view, which is in a way taken on by people like Newton, and there's an internal view which was perhaps at the same time taken on by Leibniz. Leibniz had the idea of monads, which is very close to the idea of what I would call potential or information. And finally, the idea of Teilhard de Chardin was, when the Big Bang happened, the reason that there was an explosion was because there was a small imperfection, And he called this the grain of consciousness. So therefore, the entire set of entities, both actual and potential, have within them the grains of consciousness. So on the right-hand side of this graph, we begin, roughly speaking, when language and various separating humanity from the rest of the living world came together. At the top, there's the instinct coming down, and then if you say that the energy of the creative part with life went upwards, so it's, if you like, against negentropy. It is towards the idea that the mind gets energy going in the other directions. So right at the end, there's a little intersection. And in the year 2020, some people put together a picture like this. It was nice because it happened to be 2020 when they wrote it down. So the claim was, way back in about 2020, perhaps a little earlier, that there was an information age beginning in the 20s. There's a biological age, ridiculously short. And the claim that they had is that there would be something else. Now, the one equation I promised. I have a request here. I don't care who it is, but I would like to know the name or the origin of this equation. And here's my interpretation. Line 1. There's this unnamed equation called, e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0. We could say 0 is all that is. And we, at the moment, usually label that energy. We then do the arithmetically allowed thing, and we move e to the I pi on the left and minus 1 on the right. They still they still value in energy terms equal. If we then, this is a big leap of faith, say that e to the I pi is the 3D universe, alive and evolving, then minus 1, by the principle of dynamic opposition, is the information space. So I began the first slide with saying substance and form. I would argue that the 3D universe is substance, and the form is carefully, shall we say, maintained by nature in the other space. So here we know what actual and potential is. So my request is somebody find out where that equation came from. It appears to be unique in that all these 5 things of great importance to the way we think mathematically are all in the same equation. And to close, the new slant that I took on to move from thinking about information theory to a model of reality was precipitated by Owen Barfield. And he said that the way that we think is very often clear to poets. So here's a very short extract from a poet, T.S. Eliot. He says, "Where is the life we have lost in the living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in the knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in the information? Cycles of heaven in 20 centuries or more bring us further from God and nearer to dust." I would say that's a poetic version of the equation. So I end here. I'm open to questions, and I thank you very much for listening. Anybody wish to say anything at this point?
Euler's equation. Euler's equation.
Thank you very much. Do you think Euler originated it?
Yes.
Euler discovered it, yeah. It's just sticking pi into exponential series.
Yeah, and Lou and Angel are going to be looking at that from in their presentation together. They reckon that they have a way of coming to that equation, which also is related to conversing. So I think that will be very interesting. It's beautiful, Mike. But really, do send me your PowerPoint, please. I have been making notes, and as you know, I want to catch up on various people that you relate to that I haven't yet.
Andrew or Peter, shall I stop sharing? Is that
Yes,
helpful?
Yes. Hang on.
Okay. Right.
But I'd like to say something.
I would like to hear your comments.
E to the I pi equals -1. I have a take on that as well, which could be close to the way you're thinking. More technical, but close.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I have something that my presentation, I'll basically be ripping the exponential series to bits and seeing what's inside it. E to the I pi is just a very special part of what I'll be presenting.
But when I did that group space-time master charge, then they have 3 properties which they either property or anti-property, and one of them is conservation and non-conservation. And that's basically, in principle, differentiation and integration is part of that. And E is a product purely of defining a differentiation integration process. So that represents that category. There's a real and imaginary category, and I represents that category.
Excuse me, Peter. The conversation has immediately gone into what I would call physics mode. Does anybody have any what you might call natural philosophy comments?
Well,
am I out on my own here?
Let me finish what I'm saying. Pi is essentially about dimensionality. Pi comes from dimensionality, and that's the 3rd category. Well, those 3 categories are represented E to the I pi. Together they make the opposite of 1, which is -1.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay. Please, may I say something? This is Andrew Tronton. You can't see me. You have started, ANPA, Michael. The person who speaks loud is a man called John Tordave, who's an American biochemist. And he says the fundamental thing in the world is not atoms. He says it's the cell, particularly the cell boundary. And you seem to emphasize the importance of the cell at the beginning of your talk. I think you might like to know about John, who sees the world in an entertainingly different way by looking at it life first. And the cell membrane is the fundamental thing in the world, according to him.
I've in the past had interchanges over several months with John, and we agreed to stop because I insisted that there was an equal fundamental idea, which is the, if you like, the information model of the cell and the cell membrane, but he wouldn't move out of being materialist. But I'm looking forward to his talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
By the way, I don't know if you noticed, Andrew, I did send you a copy of the slides just in case I had some trouble getting through. Yes. So I will send to Nicola, who's asked, but anybody else, if you like, you'll have the list of people. I've got Nicola's email anyway.
Okay. I will circulate those slides with the recording we have now made of this talk. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay, fantastic.
Okie dokie. Well, yeah,